Good afternoon, LEC community. Welcome to another edition of LEC Live with Latinx Leaders. My name is Edgar Palacios, and I'm the founder of the Latinx Education Collaborative. We work on increasing representation of Latinx education professionals in K-12. It is the end of June. I can't believe it. And I'm excited that we get to end of our month with our phenomenal guest today, Leslie Arreola-Hillenbrand, co-founder of Latinx Parenting. Leslie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good, Edgar. Thank you for asking.
Thanks so much for being here today and for joining us. For those that may not know of your work, will you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Latinx Parenting was founded in 2018 by myself and my co-founder, who has since left to grow her family. But I really founded it as a way to address this really huge gap in the parenting world. My daughter was born in 2012, and I started reading all of the books, and I started realizing that all of these books and all of these platforms were written by white people, it seemed, for other white people. And so I wasn't finding anything that was culturally relevant and that really reflected my narrative and my story, being a daughter of immigrants and, experiencing very unique challenges, trying to mother and trying to heal not only, the wounds that came directly from my parents, but ancestral wounds and, historical influences and all of that. And so Latinx parenting came from a frustration in not seeing my story represented, but since it has been birthed, the response has been amazing. I think a lot of people were really wanting, to see their own stories reflected, and so I'm really just grateful that people are resonating and grateful that this community is growing.
It's been cool. We saw one of your events be posted around anti-racism and non-Black families and whatnot. And we posted it on our Facebook just to share with the community, and it blew up. So there's obviously there's a need for these conversations. There's a need for these resources, and so grateful again that you are doing the work. Interested in your founding journey. What was that like? What obviously we know the inspiration behind it, but can you tell us a little bit about what was it like to co-found an organization and then get to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with parents and children for a really long time. I think I first entered a classroom when I won't tell you how old I am, but it was back in 2008, I want to say. And so I was a preschool teacher for a really long time. And over time, I realized that kids that were, bad or had behavioral issues were all getting sent to my classroom because they wouldn't have those in my classroom. And so I started realizing that the only thing that I did different than my colleagues was to really try to connect with these kids. And so I wasn't seeing the issues. I wasn't seeing the bad kid because I wanted to understand what the needs were underneath some of these behaviors. But when they would go, inevitably they would go back home and they would go, spend time with their family for winter break or whatever, they would come back with a lot of the same behavioral issues. And so over time, this is before I was a parent, I realized that, the parents are really where it's at. The parents are, and kudos to teachers, right? Like I want to say that teachers absolutely have such a huge impact on these kids of any age, and at the same time, we really want to be supportive of parents who sometimes are working two jobs, sometimes don't have the inner capacity to really be supportive to these kids. And so after a while, I started realizing I actually wanted to work with parents and give parents the tools to be able to sustain that connection with their children. A lot of times parents have come to me and said, how do I fix my kid? They're doing this, how do I make it stop? And so I think what's missing from a lot of parenting programs, and I realized this when I started working with parents, is that we totally ignore the fact that we still have healing work to do ourselves as people, right? Like forget the parenting, we still have healing work to do. And a lot of us are still very much wounded children inside. And so as we are parenting, it actually gives us an opportunity to be able to heal those wounds for ourselves. And so it's a really beautiful experience that I've had. My daughter is 8.5 now, my oldest daughter, and I have two younger ones that are 2.5 and 1. And so anytime that I am triggered or bothered, it's really clear to me that it's something that was there. It's like a button that they push, but it wasn't a button that they programmed. And so I really, I really value that healing aspect of parenting. And so when I do the workshops and when I do the coaching, it's really from a reparenting lens. And this isn't to say that we can't have compassion for our parents, and understand that they really were doing their best with the resources, with the tools, with the information that they had. And at the same time, we can give ourselves permission now to reparent ourselves as we parent our children. And so Latinx parenting is kind of a, the overall mission really is to protect children, but it's really to gain cohesion in families where we're all doing this healing work and where we're all rooting ourselves in wanting to thrive as Latinx families. And so, part of that is the reparenting. It's also rooting ourselves in social justice. It's addressing these very uncomfortable concepts like racism in our families, like colorism in our families, and being able to safely call that out, sensitively call that out, with an understanding of where our parents are coming from. And so I find that you can't leave history out of parenting. You can't leave ancestral traumas out of parenting. And so, so we try to address all of that. Obviously, I just founded it in 2018. So I'm still realizing that there's quite a bit of gaps that I cannot possibly fulfill for everybody. And so my hope is that it will grow and that more of those gaps will be addressed as we move along.
Absolutely. And that's first and foremost for our audience right now. I made sure to put the link to the Facebook page on our comments. So feel free to check that out at your convenience. I am a father of a 7-year-old son and a close to 5-year-old daughter. And I think a lot about my own wounds. There's a lot of self-reflection work that has to happen, right? Mm-hmm. I think about my relationship with my parents. I think about my relationship with my kids. And I have found that by trying to be open to, holding myself accountable as a father and holding myself, like realizing where my trigger points are as well. It's actually led me to have really incredible, I'm very fortunate to still have my parents around. And so it's allowed me to have conversations with them to be like, I don't necessarily understand why you did this.
Yeah.
But I'm like, it's starting to showcase in my own journey. And so, I again appreciate the work that you're doing, because I think that it's awesome that you're also censoring the Latinx identity in these conversations. And you're right, there's a lot of censoring of whiteness in parenting that comes along, and in the way that we outreach to parents, and in the way that we deem parents as not engaged or whatnot. And so very different standards for a community sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a blog post that I had written a couple months ago before the unrest happened, and it was titled "Parenting World So White," and it kind of addressed this frustration about how so many parent coaches, not to talk smack on parent coaches, they're trying, but so many parent coaches do leave out context. And it's not one size fits all, and you have to understand the social dynamics, and you have to understand how there is racial injustice, and you can't work with Black parents the same that you would work with your more affluent, white parents. And so, I really want to highlight that. And there are other people doing this work as well. I have a good friend of mine, Mercedes Zamudio, has this whole conference that she does called Diversity in Parenting Conference to address this issue. But yes, I mean, there's so much that we need to take into account. And I feel like the more we know about our histories, the more that we can have compassion for ourselves, and realizing that we're not just unpacking our own childhoods, we're unpacking generations of ancestral experiences. And so when I talk to my mom and I process some of this stuff with her, fortunately right now she's in a position where she's able to receive it. For many years she was not, and so a big part of it was also letting go of that expectation, right? Like our parents are still doing what they can with what they know, and so part of it has really been to increase that compassion for myself as I'm increasing it for my parents, as I'm increasing it for my children. And so I really root this in a practice of nonviolence. And the way that I define that is understanding that every behavior at the root of it has a need, right? That we're all trying to meet. So kids want to feel safe. A lot of times their behaviors come from not feeling safe, right? Not feeling connected. Adults are the same way. It doesn't matter what age you are. You're always trying to meet a need of yours. And so trying to understand that with our parents, because a lot of people have come and said, I'm really frustrated. My mom is this way and my dad is this way. And how do I get them to change? And it's not so much about getting them to change. It's really about releasing the expectation that they're going to change and creating boundaries where you can create those boundaries. And it's actually a gift to them to create boundaries, and to hope that they'll start to reflect a little bit on why those boundaries have been created. So there's so many layers to it, Edgar, that, there's no way. Like we have a 6-week series that I do on parenting with nonviolence, and it's too short. Like it's 15 hours of it. It's way too short.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we are, I think, in unlearning and relearning some of these things.
Just quickly before I ask you a follow-up question to that, I want to bring in our community into the conversation. So Lori, good to see you. We have to address it. And unfortunately, I found myself unconsciously passing down some of the wounds that I had not healed from, or the ridiculous cultural beliefs we were taught. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then Chato, good to see you. Increasing compassion for ourselves as we increase our compassion for our parents and our children. Absolutely. I mean, this is rooted in empathy a little bit, right? We have to understand our own journeys and understand that, like, we have a lot of blind spots as well. And so, yeah, a lot to think about. I'm really interested over the last, I think, 3 to 4 months. Obviously, we went into COVID-19. Parenting has significantly shifted. Education has significantly shifted. Yeah. What are some of the biggest concerns that you've seen over the last 3 months that your parents that you work with are dealing with right now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear around this idea that COVID is like damaging our children, right? And so we forget that kids are actually really resistant. Sometimes they are, but really resilient. Really resilient. And so my advice, I think, to parents who have these growing concerns about, they're not getting enough social skills, they're not getting enough interaction, they're getting too much screen time, is to just be really gentle with ourselves during this time, because this is completely unprecedented. And so our level of self-care needs to be increased, right? Our level of support seeking needs to be increased. And it may seem kind of weird because we're not in a position where I can actually hand off my kids to whoever right now. But we have to figure out ways that we can continue to support ourselves so that we're able to hold that space for our kids. And so that's been one of the really big concerns that I've heard, is like, how do I help my child to still develop adequately? And kids are, they're awesome. Like, that we have to trust in their ability to move through things, given the trust that we are developing with them, right? And there's going to be times like that I've yelled more in the last 2 months than I have, I think, my daughter's just like, you are a yeller. And I'm like, yeah, actually I'm human and I'm stressed out. And another concern that parents will have is that they mess up and then what, right? And so part of the work that I do with parents is also to remember the power of repair with our kids, because we are inevitably going to lose it. We're inevitably going to resort back into old wounds. It's not an if, it's a when that's going to happen. And so releasing the expectation that we're going to get it right 100%, even 50% of the time some days, right? There's just no way. But focus on the repair, right? Focus on the accountability, the responsibility, making sure that they know my mom, my dad, they're human, and they take responsibility when that's needed to do.
No, I really love that. And actually that really, it makes me think about my own relationship with my kids. I got divorced 4 or 5 years ago. I'm in a new relationship now. And, one of the biggest struggles for me has been really 2 different homes, 2 different styles, 2 different ways, and reminding my kids that I am human too and that I make mistakes. And also holding myself accountable. So I think something that I practice weekly now is even asking the question, all right, so if there's one thing that we can change this week in our relationship, what does that look like? And then if it's doable, if it's a reasonable request, I will follow up with them and be like, all right, how have I done thus far? And so it's a continuing conversation, and it's helped a lot. So, and I appreciate that. That's you clearly know what you're doing, and so I'm
Sometimes.
sometimes.
In theory, in practice,
theory.
it looks like something else sometimes. So yeah, I mean, it's just being
Yeah.
gentle. If they say like, "Dad, you suck," like, "Dad, you just like this, you just messed up this week," like, I don't want to talk to you. Like, a lot of it is just not taking those kinds of things personally, and a lot of it is just knowing what our role is in repairing that relationship. I just had a post yesterday about how it is always the parent's responsibility to take steps to repair. And something that I didn't mention in that post, but I do want to make clear, is that we can't always force that repair if it doesn't feel good for our children, right? That's also respecting their boundary, respecting their space, respecting their process. And so again, like we're not going to get things right. COVID just like threw a wrench in everything that we were doing. And so being extra gentle with ourselves and really not having these massive expectations of, I'm going to get, an hour of cleaning done today. Like sometimes that's just not going to happen, so it's so moment to moment. It's so day to day that, we really just have to have this practice of being empathetic to ourselves and forgiving when we mess up. Yeah. So I hold that for parents, and I really also want to just acknowledge that I'm very privileged in that I have a large yard. I have a partner right now that supports with my 3 kids. I have access to technology. I have more than 1 bedroom. So I want to just really name that privilege as well, because my level of stress is going to look very different than some families who may be watching or we may be working with, who are like 4 people to a 1 bedroom, home. And so that's very real. And that is very hard, I think, for all involved. And so noticing where can we support? Can I send you groceries? Can I send you, do you want to have a FaceTime chat just to dump, and so we have to also be there for each other and really try to kind of nurture community and check in with each other when we're within that capacity.
Thank you for that. And Martin, home life has such an impact on the students and their learning. Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Martin. Um, a little bit of a pivot. So you have a phenomenal following on Facebook, I think, and you've built a brand around this as well. When did you realize that like you hit hit the nail on the head, so to speak, in terms of like touching a nerve or finding a need in our community?
When the trolls started rolling in. It was really interesting the last couple of weeks, especially because we had a tier system, or this was the first time that I had implemented a tier system based on privilege in the anti-racism workshop that we did a week and a half ago. And so it's been really interesting to get to see the response to that and the resistance to naming that a lot of us are complicit, right, in some of these issues, and the resistance to just simply acknowledging, right? And I feel like because we as non-Black Latinx people, as white Latinx people, we live in this intersection. And this is going to go back to your point, I promise. But we live in this intersection of, we also have experienced racism in certain spaces, and we've also been complicit to it in other spaces. And so just seeing the various opinions, the various, resistance, I guess. I had a university on the East Coast reach out and say, we were going to sponsor some of your event, but now we're not going to because of this tier system. And so, so I had like a whole post about it. I was just like, this is why, this is equity. This is what we want to strive towards, because things are not equal right now. And we cannot operate as if things are the same across the board. And so that's uncomfortable for people. And so I feel like just in the last month or so, I've been realizing that there has been a nerve touched. Whenever I bring up spanking, there's a nerve touched. Whenever I bring up the way that we were treated as children, there's a nerve touched. And so all of this is just coming from like my own lived experience. I mean, not all of it, because I do have a degree in child development and family studies, but a lot of it is just from my lived experience, having been a child who was emotionally abused, who was spanked, who had all of these experiences of being praised for being lighter skin toned, you know, and so all of these issues, I feel like they intersect. And so when people start kind of, you know, challenging me on them because it's making them feel a certain way about their own lived experience, that's kind of how I know, like, okay, this is a bigger conversation, and all of it is important to have, you know. And so, yeah, so I mean,
It's important to have, absolutely, but also it can be sometimes demoralizing, you know, and I can only imagine with trolls and with people, you know, you're obviously trying to do, you're doing good work, and you're educating folks, and tension is good and discomfort is absolutely good, because we all know that we grow from that, but also it's always interesting to see the feedback that people receive. And so when I will say, when I saw the workshop, I actually appreciated the sensitivity to equity, and like, that's how you model this, right? This is how you model this behavior, and that's how you show your commitment to this work. And so, well, I'll talk to you after the fact about some of those trolls and see what else. I'm actually also curious around the term Latinx. We've received pushback about that term. You know, we believe that by using the term Latinx, we're making a commitment to social justice and equity, and it allows us to elevate the conversations of some voices that are always included from the Latinx perspective in these conversations. Like, what's it like in your neck of the woods? Did you receive similar pushback? What was that? How did you manage to navigate that?
Yeah, we still do. I mean, I still very much do get people that, you know, because I talk about decolonizing our parenting a lot and what that means, and really reclaiming ancestral practices that are honoring of children. And so when I talk about decolonization, people will say, like, why, if you're going to decolonize, why do you call yourself Latinx? You know, why don't you name yourself as Indigenous? And I do have Indigenous roots from my mom's lineage, but I don't feel comfortable saying I'm a fully Indigenous person, because I didn't grow up in that culture. You know, I feel like Latinx, Chicanx, that more closely feels like something that I can identify with, because it is a reclamation of what that term means. You know, I feel like we as Latinx people can say, yes, that is, you know, that was a name given to us by like the colonizer. However, Latinx is a step away from that language, because now we're incorporating all of the other, just like you said, all of the other narratives that may have been excluded. And so I, you know, we have to navigate it, but also I stand very firm in it and say, like, this is how I represent myself. And a lot of people actually represent themselves like this as well, and feel most comfortable calling ourselves Latinx.
Now, I appreciate that sentiment. I rarely get to talk about that. And mostly I'm talking about, you know, like, of course, like Spanish as a tool of colonization, you know, going through the history of what colonization looks like in our communities, erasure of indigenous folks. And so I find that term allows us to talk about those things in a very different perspective. But also, you know, the pushback is there, you know, but I also talk about the word Hispanic as well, and how we inherited that term and how it was given to us, and the tension that was there around. So I try to tie it back to historical references of, like, you know, this conversation about who we are as a diverse community. We're incredibly diverse, clearly. And so there's probably never going to be one right term that's going to define all of us all at the same time. And so I appreciate you sharing a little bit about that. It fascinates me just to hear other folks who are leading in this space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask you this. What do you see from a forward-thinking perspective? What are you excited most about with Latinx parents in the community? What do you see are some hopeful changes within the community itself?
Yeah, I think, you know, I really envision a world in which Latinx children feel safe. I really envision a world where Latinx children grow up with confidence, empowerment, and all of the things that we now have had to learn are okay. You know, it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to be somewhat individualistic. It's okay to, you know, admit when we're wrong, because sometimes we didn't have those models, right? And so I feel like I envision, my hope is that those of us who really want to create children who are empathetic, because we know the power that is behind empathy, right? Behind social justice, behind nonviolence. I really hope that we are truly raising this next generation to help the Latinx community as a whole thrive, not only financially, not only economically, but emotionally, mentally. Mental health is so important in our communities because we've been hurt. We've been hurt. There's been very real harms done that stem back 500 years, since colonialism. And so my hope, my vision for the future is that we start to really unlearn some of those things that helped us in our survival in the past, but no longer are needed.
Oh man, so much to ask about that and just follow-ups. How have you evolved in your own learnings? How have you taken up anti-racist issues? How have you committed to this work? Like what initially motivated you to get into this space and to lead from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's always been really interesting because my husband is white, and so it's been very clear that our cultural histories are very different. And there's been a lot of education that I've had to do for him, and compassion that I've had to grow also for him, because I feel like especially during this time, there's a lot that has been coming up, and it's like, wow, I had no idea there was this much of a difference, And so I feel like for me personally, raising children who are both white and identify as Latinx, it's really important for me to get very clear about my identity, and to help them get clear about what their identity is and what their privilege is and how to wield that privilege in support of other people who may not have those same privileges. And so for me, it really stemmed from when my daughter was, when I was pregnant with her actually, and just wanting to make sure that I had a really strong sense of how, I wanted her identity to unfold. And so I didn't want her to lose her culture. I don't want her to lose Spanish. And I'm really bad at speaking Spanish to her sometimes. But it's really important that we come back to that, and for her to have a sense of integration into her culture, which is my culture. I grew up completely immersed in Mexican culture. And so I really feel like that's really important. Family is really important. And at the same time, I do want her to be able to feel safe with me and to share, where her discomforts are as well. And I think something that's really important for parents and teachers and anybody is to operate from this growth mindset and know that we don't know everything and we will never possibly know everything. And so approaching parenting, approaching teaching, approaching just living with humility around, what more needs to be learned. And so I feel like that's really like what has pushed me is I just genuinely want to learn. I just genuinely want to know how to integrate the knowledge into who I am, into how I move, into how I operate, and hoping that will be a good model for my children.
How is your daughter navigating belonging to the two cultures? Are you seeing that tension already rise up in her and at this age, or are you seeing her be more empowered than maybe we were at that age?
She's funny because we were, we've had these conversations for a couple of years now where I let her know, I said, because some of her best friends are Black, and look a lot darker than she does. And so we talked about privilege a couple of years ago. And I said, it's really like if you go to Target with your friend and you're leaving and the alarm goes off, the security guard may look at your friend before they look at you to see whether one of you took something, and so naming examples like that. She's like, well, that's not fair. And I'm like, no, that's not fair. And so we've explored scenarios like that. And also not that long ago, about like a month ago, she was like, Mom, I'm brown, right? I'm brown. And I was like, no, like you're pretty white, And so I don't ever want her to feel shame about how she identifies, but I do want her to understand that these are very real things. And I think something that really helped me a couple months ago, I took Layla Saad's, she has a course called Parenting and White Supremacy, which is amazing because she talks about her lived experience and how when she was growing up, a little boy, I think when she was in kindergarten or first grade, said that her skin looked like poop. And so I'm hyper aware that my children are not going to have these experiences, and that it's actually a function of my privilege that I actually get to teach these things abstractly to my children, and how unfair that is, and how it's not really a choice, I think, for us as parents to have these conversations. Like, it's no longer something that we could just choose to ignore, because, I mean, all we have to do is look around, right? Like, look around at how terrible these things are. And I think specifically for Latinx culture, I remember when Philando Castile got murdered in his car. That was the last video that I had watched of a Black man getting murdered, and realizing that the man who murdered him was a Latino man. And so I wrote this like long essay when that happened about colorism in Latinx families, and how very real it is that we want to be in proximity to whiteness, and how very real it is that we will look at a little girl who looks like my children, who has like very, very light hair, very light colored eyes, and say like, oh, qué bonita, qué hermosa, qué güerita. And we won't talk that way about darker skinned children in our families, and how harmful that is for those children. And so I really, we are not exempt from racism in our culture, and colorism, intracultural colorism. And so it's not a choice. Like, we don't have that liberty to just not talk about it, because you're going to be actively doing a disservice to the society if you don't address these things with your children.
What's been the appetite of parents to engage in these conversations? Like, what's some of the pushback that you receive from parents directly around engaging in these conversations, and what are some of the wins that you've seen through your work?
Yeah, there's fear, there's just the fear of, I don't know how to talk to my kids about this. There's the fear of, what if I get it wrong? What if people think differently of me? My mother-in-law is a white woman, and so I have these like anti-racism books laying around, and so yesterday she was here, and then she left, and I realized that I had these books laying around, and my initial was like, oh my God, like, what is she going to think? What is she going to think about this? And so I had to kind of process that and say, like, what is the fragility around, for me, around letting her know the truth, that yes, we are engaged in anti-racism practice, and so I feel like a lot of us don't also want to do a lot of the labor that needs to happen. Us as parents, like, we want to get it right, and we also want to be we want to have self-preservation around these things too, because they do impact us at a feeling level. I feel like if, as I've been talking to my husband, I realized that he operates very cerebrally, and he's just like, well, I want to see the stats, and I want to see, and I'm just like, no, these are real human experiences. Like, we want to make sure that those human experiences are seen and validated and known. And so I feel like for parents, it's trying to figure out which route to take with explaining and with talking to our children. And it doesn't have to be that complicated. It doesn't have to be like you sit them down and you talk to that and you say, like, this is how things are. It's just about interweaving this anti-racist value into your everyday. So it's about noticing the content that they're consuming, whether it's books or movies, or if it's a show. My daughter's really funny, because now she'll be watching a show and she'll come to me and be like, Mom, there's Black people in this show. Like, there's brown people in this show. And I'll be like, cool. And she's like, yeah, like, because we've had those conversations a lot. And so she's starting to notice, who is missing from these conversations, who is missing from this content. And so I haven't gotten a lot of pushback. I've gotten a lot of celebration that we are, giving ourselves permission to have these conversations, but it is hard to know exactly how, and so I just want to emphasize that there isn't one specific way. I think as long as we are making ourselves open and we're developing that trusting relationship, and we're being very mindful of kind of what we're exposing them to, I feel like that is anti-racism practice, right? That is part of just parenting, even if you want to leave the anti-racism out of it, like, parenting just is helping our children to notice these things, if we're rooting our parenting in social justice and racial justice.
What are some resources that have been helpful to you in navigating these conversations? I think you mentioned a couple of folks already. Any that particularly stand out for you that have helped you on this journey?
Yeah, there's an account which is huge now. It's called The Conscious Kid, and they follow Latinx parenting, and I'm just like, oh. I'm like starstruck because they had contributed to this Nickelodeon special yesterday that Nickelodeon had around race by Alicia Keys, and I haven't watched it yet. I'm gonna watch it, but I feel like The Conscious Kid has a whole library of books that they recommend for parents. I know that there's a couple of accounts. The names aren't coming to me right now, but like there's, Santo. Oh my gosh, what is his name? I don't remember his last name, but there's an author who wrote C is for Community, and A for Activist. And so making sure that like we are exposing our children to these different narratives, and it's not all just like Dr. Seuss and Amelia Bedelia or whatever. Like I feel like as long as we are using Google to our advantage. But a really, really amazing resource is The Conscious Kid. And then for adults, Layla F. Saad. There's Rachel Ricketts is an anti-racism educator. Rachel Cargill is another one. And so I feel like the more that I've been educating myself, the more I'm able to kind of distill what I'm learning and being able to offer it to my kids. And granted, my two younger ones are 2 and 1, but my 2-year-old's best friend is a little Black boy who is the son of a really good friend of mine who is Black. And so we have these conversations all the time in front of our older daughters who are 8. And so I feel like, the exposure is so important. But I mean, I can send it to you. I have this like whole resource list prepared that I gave to the people who attended the anti-racism workshop that just has like more than you could ever spend looking into it.
And I appreciate that. And just for the community, put the consciouskid.org link in our comments as well. That way you have that resources available to you. I'm interested in more in terms of as you grow the organization, what are your plans for the future? Obviously you do workshops now, you're doing a lot of virtual content because that's the way of the world at the moment. How do you see your organization growing? What kind of work do you want to get into within the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Right now, I am just a one-woman operation. And so it'd be really great to train other educators in other places. We've gotten a lot of people that have reached out. I do have an intern, and so she works like 5 hours a week. But I have had people reach out and say, like, do you have anything like this in Boston? Do you have anything like this in Texas? And it's like, no, I want to help you build it. I want to help you build these communities. And so my hope is that I can train other people to do this work in their local areas, so that we can just, this isn't about Latinx parenting. It's not about Leslie. This is like really a movement to really reclaim, some of the values around child honoring, some of the values around realizing that colonialism was really toxic, and how do we dismantle these oppressive systems beginning in our homes. And so I find it really hopeful, and I find it really exciting that people are reaching out and saying, I want to do a support group. How do I do that? And so right now, my focus is on just doing them myself, but I'm hoping that, and what I'm seeing actually is that people who are starting to come to the workshops are coming to more than just the one workshop. Like I'll see the same names popping up in like every workshop and every support, circle that we've done. And so I want to make sure that I'm keeping in touch with those people to make sure that this can expand in local areas, because they really, really miss in-person work. I feel like there's such a different quality to in-person work than there is to digital. And I love the digital workshops as well, but there's something about being in a circle with actual people, actual bodies in the same room. And so I'm really looking forward to doing that again.
The interpersonal interaction is so key to some learning sometimes. And so I've been ideating on how we can reconstruct or construct something similar in the virtual space, but incredibly hard to do. But I think even holding space, though, I think is important. And so like I stand there in that space of like, all right, we're not going to get it right. I don't think anybody has any particular idea how to do this well yet. maybe some people do, but definitely not me. And so it's been interesting. I'm interested in how quickly you grew your following as well. What were some of your strategies around that? Was it word of mouth? Obviously, quality of work. What was that experience like as well?
I don't even know. Like, I think, I think consistency, right? I feel like I try to post like 1 or 2 things a day. There's a big range of the kinds of posts that I post. I try to highlight Black and brown artists on the page. If you've looked on the Instagram page, you'll notice that like every other post is is a piece of art from a brown or Black person. And so I feel like I want to amplify brown and Black voices. I'm a white presenting Latina, and I'm not representative of the entire Latinx experience. And so I really like pulling, various things and various projects that are happening, and really giving them a platform. And so, the following has just like blown up, and I'm so grateful for that. But I don't think I've like sat really long enough to think about like what was the formula for that. I've had other people, I've had like friends of mine reach out and say like, how do you do that? And I'm like, I don't know, you post. Like you post what you post. I don't know.
I think you're right. Consistency is key, but I also think that you're not willing to. You're absolutely willing to take some firm stances on some conversations and leave that space of what I think is pretty authentic and pretty like, just raw truth and raw honesty in that. And so I think people. My thought would be that people are just attracted to that because like we don't see a lot of that in a lot of communities, and so it's cool to see you modeling the way as well. I've talked to Susana a little bit about like how do we help amplify that voice, and also how do we shift the tone of our organization as well to be a little bit more aligned with that, and to be just because I think it's we in this work in becoming anti-racist and being anti-racist in that daily practice, we have to take some really difficult stances, and not necessarily difficult for us, but it can be really hard to hear for some folks. And so being prepared to also engage in those conversations and that dialogue, and the balance of education versus frustration is always going to be interesting for us to navigate, I think.
Yeah, I talked to a friend of mine. Her name's Emilia, and she is at Corazon Counseling, and we were talking about just like some of the feedback that we've been getting. She also is going to be doing an anti-racism workshop, and I was like telling her about some of the pushback that I've been getting, and she's like, "Mujer, are you giving yourself limpias like every day?" She's like, mal de ojo is very real, and you need to make sure that you are like cleansing your energy. And so I'm like, you know what? I haven't done it probably as much as I should, because I feel like, yes, it's great that I have this large platform, but something that I've been really reflecting on the last 2 weeks is like, it puts me in a really vulnerable position, for criticism, for judgment, I feel like people see the amount of followers I have and think that it's a team, and it's like, no, this is actually just me, and I'm a mother, and I have 3 kids. And so I want to make it really clear that like there's humans behind these accounts. There's people with real feelings, and those feelings can get really hurt. And so I have to actually like really ground myself in my own reparenting practices, which is what I try to share with parents, and think like, okay, Leslie, like you're not in trouble here. Like you're not getting sent to a corner. You're not getting sent to your room. You're okay. You can keep breathing. And so I feel like part of just having that platform, it allows me to engage in some of these practices that I want to share. And so I'm grateful for that. But yeah, it does get messy. It does get messy, and this is a hard population to work with. And yeah, I'm sure you can relate to that too.
To a certain extent, I think, it has to be messy, right? The work, I think, requires messiness, and it requires, even for us as practicing folks in the space, like there are some right answers. There's some right like delineations that we're gonna agree to, and then there's a lot of gray in the space. And so I think hopefully we are open to ideas and suggestions, and we welcome criticism. But some days I'm right there with you, like very small few people doing this work right now as part of this organization, and we all have feelings.
Yeah.
So that's that's definitely part of it. I will absolutely consider like the whole reparenting thing and really grounding myself in those comments. Like, all right, I'm not grounded, like,
Yeah.
and also just shifting some of those narratives and really believing and standing behind the work, I think is so important.
Yeah.
Kip, we are almost towards the end of our conversation, so this is insane. I always enjoy these moments where I'm like, there's so much more to talk about. What are some things that we may have not covered over the course of the last hour, but do you really want to make sure that folks understand, or that folks that we don't miss the opportunity to share with?
Yeah, I think, I again, like I just want to make sure that we know that it's okay to mess up, right? Like it's okay to get anti-racism wrong. It's okay to get parenting wrong. It's okay to get life wrong every now and then. And I do want to share that as long as our practices are rooted in self-reflection, and that we can take steps to set intentions and to actually develop practices around those intentions, I feel like we will be in good shape. I really think that if we allow ourselves permission, if we give ourselves permission to really get real about not only what we've experienced, but maybe the harms that we have done, or the things that we have been complicit in, there's no shame in it, right? It's just kind of acknowledging. And so I think that a lot of the resistance around engaging in an anti-racism practice or engaging in full acknowledgement of our own traumas comes from shame. And so as much as we can release that shame and understand that, like, we're not in trouble, right? No one's going to come and punish us. That we can really embody this humility, and again, model the learning, the forever learning for our children. And so I find that so powerful, that we can always go back to self-reflection and we can always start over.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my great mentors always reminds me, you can always start your day over. It doesn't matter what time it is. You can just like, refresh. Yep. Lori, giving you claps.
Thank you, Lori.
Celebrating that. The work is hard, but there are people who only want to hear what they want to hear. They refuse to have a growth mindset and would rather abuse the messenger.
Yeah, I mean, but remember that everything is trying to meet a need, right? And so if somebody's coming at you, like if somebody is coming at me because I used the wrong term or whatever, like that's trying to meet a need for them. And so, yes, I'm going to hold a boundary, but also I can hold space for whatever need that is trying to be met there. And so sometimes people just really, have this need for justice. And so if they feel like you're contributing to the injustice because of what you're saying, they're gonna come after you. And so just, it's not about just taking the hits, right? It's not about, taking the abuse, if you name it abuse. It's really just about holding the boundary around it and also saying that is actually not my responsibility to take care of for you, and saying, here you go, that's for you. This is obviously your wounds coming up. And so I will acknowledge my part when it's my part to acknowledge, but I really want to acknowledge that you also have a part in this. And so it's the same way that we parent, it's the same way that we parent. It's like, I will take responsibility and I'm going to hold loving limits with you.
I love that. Holding loving limits, and and thank you for that reminder and that gift of saying, of acknowledging and also reminding us that some people need to work on their own issues, and that may not be for us to solve, and that's okay. I think that we all need to hear that from time to time, particularly in this line of work. As a community, how can we support you?
Oh man, you can come give me some massages and back stretch. No, you can come babysit whenever you want. Here's my address. No, you can support Latinx parenting just by following. So at Latinx parenting on Instagram, on Facebook, Latinx parenting. If you search it, it'll come up. And I mean, I'm sure you'll link it. And if you subscribe via latinxparenting.org, there's a way to subscribe. I'm considering at some point developing a Patreon, but again, I'm mindful of my capacity to be able to provide, whatever it is. But, as long as people are subscribing and just aware of what's happening and taking the offerings, if they feel like they're resonating with what's trying to be shared, I feel like that's supportive enough.
That's cool. Are you a fully fledged 501c3 yet?
No, not yet.
But
no, not yet. Right now we're LLC right now. There's so much paper around becoming a 501c3, and so again, I'm just one person. Once we start, I am building it as if it is a 501c3 though, and so once that happens, it'll be a smooth transition into it.
Cool. Well, Leslie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today in conversation. Thank
you so much, Edgar. I appreciate you.
This was phenomenal. So again, appreciate that. And LEC community, thank you so much for joining us today as well. The contact information is definitely in our comments below. So feel free to take a look and go and support Latinx parenting on their Facebook and other social media following. So with that said, I hope everybody has a great remainder of their day. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.